The scorching August sun of 1887 beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather hat, squinting against the glare that shimmered off the desert floor like liquid silver. Beside him, Samuel Torres wiped the sweat from his dark brow with a faded bandana, his weathered face etched with the same concern that had been gnawing at both men for the past 2 days. "Water's running low, Jake," Sam said quietly, his voice hoarse from the dry air. He gestured toward the 100 head of cattle spread out behind them, their tongues hanging out as they plodded forward through the sand and scrub brush. "These beasts won't make it much further without a proper drink." Jake nodded grimly, his blue eyes scanning the endless expanse of the Mojave Desert that stretched before them like a sea of gold and rust-colored earth. The two cowboys had been partners for over 8 years, driving cattle for the Double Bar Ranch, and they'd never faced a situation quite like this. The spring they'd counted on finding had run dry, and the next water source was still 2 days away, if they could find it. "We'll push through Devil's Canyon," Jake decided, pointing toward a narrow passage between towering red rock formations in the distance. "It'll cut half a day off our journey, and there might be shade for the cattle to rest." Sam frowned, his calloused hands tightening on his horse's reins. "That canyon's got a bad reputation, amigo. Old Miguel back at the ranch told stories about men going in there and never coming out. Said the Apache used to hunt there, and the rocks play tricks on a man's mind." "Apache haven't been through here in years," Jake replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "And we don't have much choice. Look at those cattle, they're already stumbling. We lose any more time and we'll be driving nothing but buzzard bait." The two men had started their journey from the Double Bar Ranch 5 days earlier with high spirits and clear skies. Jake, at 32, was tall and lean with sun-bleached hair and hands that could gentle the wildest Mustang or quick-draw a Colt 45 when trouble called. Sam, slightly older at 35, was built like a barrel with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, his Mexican heritage evident in his dark features and the rapid-fire Spanish he muttered when frustrated. As they approached the mouth of Devil's Canyon, the temperature seemed to drop despite the blazing sun overhead. The rock walls rose up on either side like the jaws of some prehistoric beast, casting long shadows that provided blessed relief from the heat. The cattle, sensing water somewhere ahead, quickened their pace slightly, their hooves raising clouds of red dust that hung in the still air. "Something doesn't feel right about this place," Sam muttered, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his revolver's grip. "The birds have gone quiet and even the wind has died down." Jake felt it too, an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their ears like cotton. The only sounds were the steady clop of their horses' hooves and the occasional lowing of cattle. Even the usual desert creatures seemed to have vanished, leaving behind an eerie emptiness that made both men's skin crawl. They rode deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in around them until only a strip of blue sky remained visible overhead. The path twisted and turned, following what might once have been a riverbed, but was now nothing more than cracked earth and scattered stones. Ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock faces watched their passage like silent sentinels from a forgotten time. There, Sam pointed ahead, to where the canyon floor seemed to open into a wider area. "Looks like there might be some grass there for the cattle to graze." But as they rounded the final bend, both men pulled up short. The canyon didn't open into a meadow as they'd hoped. Instead, it ended in a high wall of red rock, trapping them in a natural cul-de-sac with no apparent way forward. "Dead end," Jake said, his voice tight with worry. "We'll have to turn the herd around and backtrack." That's when they heard the sound, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the very walls of the canyon itself. At first, they thought it might be thunder from a distant storm, but the sky remained cloudless and blue. "Rock slide," Sam whispered, his face going pale beneath his tan. "The walls are coming down." The rumbling grew louder, and both men spurred their horses forward, shouting at the cattle to move. But it was too late. With a sound like the world tearing apart, tons of red rock came crashing down from the canyon walls, sealing the entrance behind them and trapping them in what would become their tomb. In the sudden silence that followed, dust filled the air like a thick fog, and Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres found themselves staring at their fate with the grim understanding that no one would ever find them in this forgotten corner of the desert. 5 years later, October 1892, Tom Bradley wiped the morning chill from his mustache as he surveyed the sprawling herd of longhorns spread across the valley floor. At 58, the veteran rancher had driven more cattle trails than most men had hot meals, but something about this particular drive felt different. Maybe it was the unseasonably cool weather, or maybe it was the nagging memory of Jake Morrison and Sam Torres, two of the finest cowboys he'd ever employed, who had simply vanished into the desert 5 years ago. "Mr. Bradley!" The shout came from his youngest hand, 18-year-old Billy Hutchins, who was galloping toward him from the eastern ridge. The boy's face was flushed with excitement and something else, fear perhaps. "You need to see what we found up in that canyon." Tom's weathered face creased into a frown. "Slow down, son. What canyon?" "Devil's Canyon, sir," Billy panted, pulling his horse to a stop. "We were chasing strays when Cookie's horse stumbled into what looked like a cave opening. But it ain't no cave, Mr. Bradley. It's like a whole hidden valley back there." Cookie Martinez, the drive's cook and one of Tom's most trusted men, rode up behind Billy with 2 other cowboys, Pete Wilson and Dutch Kellerman. Cookie's usually jovial face was solemn, his dark eyes troubled. "Boss," Cookie said in his thick accent, "you're going to want to see this yourself. We found things that belonged to somebody who was trapped back there." Tom felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of things?" "Saddles, boss, 2 of them. And bones, lots of bones, cattle bones mostly, but—" Cookie paused, crossing himself. "Some human bones, too." The ride to Devil's Canyon took 20 minutes, winding through sagebrush and over rocky terrain that grew increasingly desolate. Tom had avoided this area for years, partly due to superstition, and partly because it was too far off the main trail to be worth the trouble. But as they approached the towering red rock walls, he noticed something different about the canyon mouth. "There used to be a rock slide here," Dutch observed, pointing to scattered boulders and a clear passage where none had existed 5 years ago. "Looks like the spring floods washed most of it away." They dismounted and led their horses through the narrow opening. The canyon twisted and turned for several hundred yards before opening into a circular valley, perhaps 2 acres in size, completely hidden from the outside world. What they found there made Tom Bradley's blood run cold. Scattered across the sandy floor were the bleached remains of cattle, dozens of skeletons picked clean by desert scavengers and worn smooth by wind and weather. But it was what lay near the far wall of the canyon that drew their attention, like iron filings to a magnet. 2 skeletons, clearly human, lay side by side beneath what remained of a crude shelter made from saddle leather and cattle bones. Nearby sat 2 saddles, their leather cracked and faded, but still recognizable. Tom knelt beside one of them, running his fingers over the initials carved into the horn. "J.M., Jake Morrison," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And this one here." He moved to the second saddle, finding the familiar burn mark of Sam Torres's ranch brand. "Samuel Torres. Sweet Jesus, they've been here all this time." Billy crept closer, his young face pale with awe and horror. "How long do you reckon they survived in here, Mr. Bradley?" Tom studied the scene with the eye of a man who'd spent his life reading the stories written in dust and stone. The shelter was well constructed, built against the canyon wall where it would catch morning sun, but stay cool in the afternoon heat. Nearby he could see the remains of several fires and what looked like a crude attempt at digging a well. "Long enough to try making a life of it," he said finally. "Look here, they organized the cattle bones into a windbreak, used their saddle blankets to catch dew for water. These boys didn't just lie down and die, they fought to survive." Cookie pointed to something glinting in the sand near the skeletons. "There's something else, Jefe." Tom walked over and carefully brushed away the sand, revealing a small metal box, the kind cowboys used to keep their personal papers dry. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth, was a letter written in Jake's familiar scrawl. "To whoever finds this," Tom read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent canyon. "My name is Jake Morrison, and this here is Samuel Torres. We've been trapped in this canyon since August 15th, 1887, when a rock slide sealed us in. We've got near 100 head of cattle, and enough supplies to last maybe 2 weeks if we're careful." He paused, looking up at his men's expectant faces before continuing. "The cattle are drinking from a small seep in the rocks, but it's going dry fast. Sam's trying to dig a well while I work on moving some of the smaller rocks from the slide. We figure somebody's bound to come looking for us soon. If you're reading this, then I reckon our figuring was wrong." The letter went on to describe their daily struggle for survival, their growing realization that rescue might never come, and their determination to make the best of their situation. The final entry, dated October 3rd, 1887, was written in a shakier hand. "Sam passed yesterday. Fever took him after he hurt his leg trying to climb the canyon wall. I buried him as best I could under the rocks. Don't know how much longer I can last without him. We was partners for 8 years, and I can't imagine going on without my friend. To whoever finds us, tell the boys at the double bar that we fought to the end. Jake Morrison, October 1892. Tom folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Around him, his men stood in respectful silence, their hats in their hands like they were attending a funeral, which, in a way, they were. "We'll take them home," Tom said finally. "Both of them. They deserve a proper burial, and their families deserve to know what happened." As they prepared to leave the hidden canyon, Tom took one last look around at what had been Jake and Sam's final resting place. In the growing shadows of late afternoon, he could almost see them, two cowboys who had faced the impossible with courage and dignity, never giving up hope even when hope was all they had left. The task of preparing Jake and Sam's remains for transport was somber work that none of Tom's men would ever forget. They worked in respectful silence as the desert wind whistled through the canyon walls, carrying with it the weight of 5 years' worth of unanswered questions. Cookie Martinez, despite his tough exterior, had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he carefully wrapped the bones in clean blankets from their supplies. "These were good men, Jefe," he said to Tom. "They deserved better than this." "They were the best," Tom agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Jake could read cattle like other men read books, and Sam could gentle a wild bronc with nothing but patience and kind words." Billy Hutchins, who had never seen death up close before this day, struggled to maintain his composure as he helped gather the personal effects scattered around the makeshift camp. Among the items they found were Jake's harmonica, still in its leather case, Sam's silver pocket watch stopped at 3:17, a deck of playing cards worn smooth from countless games, and a small leather-bound Bible that had belonged to Sam's mother. "Look at this," Dutch Kellerman called from near the canyon wall. He was examining a series of marks scratched into the red rock, a crude calendar that tracked their days of captivity. The marks continued for nearly 3 months before stopping abruptly. They kept track right up to the end. Pete Wilson, a man of few words who had ridden with Jake and Sam on previous drives, found something else that made his throat tight. Carved into a flat section of rock near their shelter were the words, "Jake and Sam, partners to the end, 1887. They knew, Pete said quietly. They knew they weren't getting out, but they faced it together. As they loaded the remains onto pack horses, Tom made a decision that would haunt the local newspapers for weeks to come. "We're taking the saddles too," he announced, "and anything else that belonged to them. Their families will want these things." The journey back to the main herd took on the solemnity of a funeral procession. Tom rode point, leading the pack horses carrying his former employees, while his men followed in respectful silence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, and more than once Tom found himself looking back at Devil's Canyon, wondering what other secrets the unforgiving landscape might be hiding. When they reached the main herd, word of the discovery spread quickly among the cowboys. Men who had known Jake and Sam removed their hats and crossed themselves as the pack horses passed. Several of the older hands shared stories of the missing cowboys, their skill with horses, their loyalty to friends, their laughter around campfires under starlit skies. "Remember that time Sam roped that ornery bull with a broken horn?" recalled Tex Murphy, a grizzled cowhand who had worked with both men. "That beast had been terrorizing the herd for days, and Sam just walked up to it calm as you please, talking to it in Spanish like it was his own child." "And Jake," added another cowboy. "Jake could find water in the desert better than any Apache tracker. If he couldn't find a way out of that canyon, then there wasn't one to be found." That evening, as the herd settled in for the night near a small creek, Tom Bradley sat by the campfire writing letters, one to Jake's sister in Kansas City, another to Sam's elderly parents in San Antonio. The words came hard, each sentence a struggle to convey the mixture of grief and closure that the discovery had brought. Cookie approached the fire carrying 2 cups of coffee, the strong brew steaming in the cool night air. "You knew them better than anyone, boss. What do you think happened in those last days?" Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as he stared into the dancing flames. "I think they did exactly what good men do when facing the impossible," he said finally. "They looked out for each other until the very end." The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would add another layer to the mystery. As the herd moved through a narrow pass, they met a group of Paiute Indians traveling south for the winter. The tribal elder, a dignified man named Walking Bear, whom Tom had dealt with before in peaceful trade, rode forward for conversation. "How you carry the spirits of lost men?" Walking Bear said in careful English, his dark eyes studying the pack horses. My people felt their presence in the canyon of red walls. Tom nodded respectfully. 2 cowboys. They were trapped there 5 years ago. Walking Bear's weathered face grew sad. We heard their calls for help in the early days. Our young warriors wanted to climb down and assist them, but the spirits of that place are dangerous. Many rocks fall there when the earth is angry. You knew they were there? Billy asked, incredulous. We left water and dried meat on the canyon rim, the elder explained, but the spirits took our offerings away in the night. Perhaps they reached the trapped men, perhaps not. We could do no more without risking our own people. This revelation added a bittersweet note to the discovery. Even in their isolation, Jake and Sam had not been completely forgotten. The desert had whispered their plight to those who knew how to listen, and in their own way the Paiute had tried to help. As the Indian band continued on their way, Tom found himself thinking about the interconnectedness of life on the frontier. Cowboys, Indians, settlers, ranchers, all of them struggling to survive in a land that could be both beautiful and merciless, sometimes in the same day. The drive continued for 3 more days, but the mood had changed. What had started as a routine cattle drive had become something more significant, a mission to bring 2 lost souls home and provide answers to questions that had lingered too long unanswered. On the 4th day, they crested a low ridge and saw the familiar buildings of Red Creek, the nearest town to the Double Bar Ranch. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang across the valley. It was the sound of civilization, of life continuing despite loss, of hope persisting in the face of tragedy. Tom Bradley straightened in his saddle and urged his horse forward. It was time to bring Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres home at last. The news spread through Red Creek like wildfire on dry grass. By the time Tom Bradley's cattle drive reached the outskirts of town, it seemed like every soul within 20 miles had gathered along Main Street. Men stood with their hats in their hands. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and children pressed close to their parents, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Sheriff Dan Hawkins, a barrel-chested man with iron-gray hair and a star-shaped scar on his left cheek, met Tom at the town limits. The 2 men had been friends for over 15 years, and Dan's weathered face showed the weight of old guilt as he approached. "Tom," the sheriff said quietly, extending his hand, "I heard about what you found. I want you to know we searched for those boys, searched hard for near on 3 weeks." "I know you did, Dan," Tom replied, accepting the handshake. "Nobody could have found them in that canyon. Hell, if it weren't for that stray cattle and the spring floods washing away the rockslide, they'd still be there." Behind them, the pack horses carrying Jake and Sam's remains drew the hushed attention of the growing crowd. Martha Jenkins, the town's schoolteacher, and Jake's former sweetheart, stood among the onlookers with tears streaming down her face. She had never married after Jake's disappearance, holding on to hope long after others had given up. "Miss Martha," Tom said gently, dismounting and walking over to her. "Jake, he had this with him." He pulled Jake's harmonica from his saddlebag and placed it carefully in her trembling hands. "I thought you should have it." Martha clutched the instrument to her chest, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to play for me on Sunday evenings, said music was the only thing that could make the desert feel like home." Her composure cracked then, and she wept openly for the man she had lost twice, once to hope and now to finality. Reverend Thomas Coleman, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a voice that could carry across the entire valley, stepped forward from the crowd. "Tom, I'll be honored to perform the service. These men deserve all the dignity we can provide." "Appreciate it, Reverend," Tom nodded. They were good Christian men, both of them. Sam especially. Never missed a Sunday service when we were near a town. The crowd followed the solemn procession to Jensen's funeral parlor, where old Henrik Jensen, the town's undertaker and carpenter, waited with 2 simple but well-crafted pine coffins. Henrik had worked through the night after hearing the news, crafting the caskets with the same care he put into church pews and baby cradles. "No charge," Henrik said firmly when Tom reached for his wallet. "These men rode for all of us at one time or another. It's the least I can do." As word continued to spread, more familiar faces appeared in town. Miguel Santos, the old vaquero who had warned Jake and Sam about Devil's Canyon, rode in from the Double Bar Ranch with tears in his eyes and a bottle of tequila to toast his fallen friends. Buck Williams, a former trail partner, arrived from 3 counties over, having ridden hard through the night after receiving Tom's telegram. "They were the finest cowboys I ever knew," Buck said, his voice thick with emotion as he stood in the funeral parlor. "Jake could read weather like a book, and Sam could gentle the wildest horse with nothing but patience and sugar cubes." The preparation for the funeral became a community effort. The ladies of Red Creek, led by Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the mayor's wife, organized food for the anticipated crowd. The local seamstress, Elena Rodriguez, worked with Martha Jenkins to create a memorial quilt featuring scenes from Jake and Sam's life: horses, cattle, desert sunsets, and two friends riding side by side. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, proprietor Irish Pat O'Malley declared that the first drink would be free for anyone wanting to toast the memory of Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres. Even the most hardened gamblers and drifters who frequented the establishment spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the discovery. "I remember them, boys," said Caleb Porter, a grizzled prospector who rarely came down from his mountain claim. "They helped me move supplies up to my mine during the bad winter of '85. Never asked for nothing in return, just said it was the right thing to do." Young Billy Hutchins found himself something of a celebrity, being one of the men who had actually discovered the canyon, but the attention made him uncomfortable, and he spent most of his time helping with preparations rather than retelling the story. The sight of those two skeletons, lying side by side in their final resting place, had aged the boy considerably in the span of a few days. As evening fell, Tom Bradley sat in the sheriff's office with Dan Hawkins, sharing a bottle of whiskey and the weight of memory. Through the window they could see lanterns being lit throughout the town as people prepared for the next day's funeral. "You know what bothers me most?" Tom said, staring into his glass. "It's not that they died. Hell, we all knew the risks when we took to the trails. It's that they died thinking nobody was looking for them. That letter Jake wrote, you could feel the loneliness in every word." Dan nodded, refilling both their glasses. "Maybe so, but you also saw how they faced it. Together, with dignity. Not many men can say they lived up to their principles when death came calling." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Martha Jenkins stood in the doorway, holding Jake's harmonica and wearing a dress of deep blue, Jake's favorite color. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes. "I wanted to ask, would it be proper for me to play something tomorrow at the service? Jake taught me a few songs on this." She held up the harmonica. Tom's throat tightened with emotion. "Miss Martha, I can't think of anything that would honor him more." As she left, Dan watched through the window as she walked down the moonlit street. "Love's a powerful thing," he observed. "Strong enough to wait 5 years for answers, strong enough to let go when they finally come." The night passed slowly, with many residents of Red Creek lying awake thinking about mortality, friendship, and the cruel uncertainties of frontier life. Tomorrow would bring closure, but tonight belonged to memory and the weight of what might have been. In the funeral parlor, Henrik Jensen made his final adjustments to the coffins, ensuring everything was perfect for the morning service. As he worked by lamplight, he whispered a prayer for two men he had known only by reputation, but respected deeply for the way they had lived and died with honor intact. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, while overhead, the same stars that had watched over Jake and Sam's final days continued their eternal vigil over the little town that had gathered to remember them. Dawn broke clear and cool over Red Creek on the morning of October 18, 1892, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and purple that Jake Morrison would have called God's own canvas. By 9 o'clock, the small wooden church was packed beyond capacity, with dozens of mourners standing in the back and spilling out onto the street. Cowboys, ranchers, merchants, and families, all united in their respect for two men who had embodied the best of frontier spirit. Reverend Coleman stood at the pulpit, his usually commanding voice gentled by the solemnity of the occasion. "We gather today not just to mourn Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres, but to celebrate lives well lived and friendship that endured even unto death." In the front row, Martha Jenkins sat with Jake's harmonica cradled in her hands, wearing the blue dress and a small silver locket that contained the only photograph she had of Jake. Beside her, an elderly Mexican couple, Sam's parents who had traveled from San Antonio, wept quietly, their weathered hands clasped together in shared grief. "Jake and Sam represented something precious on this frontier," the Reverend continued. "They were men who understood that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying human, about caring for others even when you're facing your own darkness." Tom Bradley, wearing his only suit and fighting back tears, rose to speak about the men he had known and respected. "I hired Jake Morrison 12 years ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "He was just a kid then, But he had something you can't teach: integrity. And when he partnered up with Sam Torres, well, you never saw two men who complemented each other better. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. They died as they lived, together, looking out for each other, never giving up hope. That letter Jake wrote, it didn't complain about bad luck or curse the desert. It just asked that we tell folks they fought to the end. Well, I'm telling you now, they did. Several other men spoke, sharing memories and stories that painted a picture of two cowboys who had touched many lives through simple acts of decency and kindness. Miguel Santos, leaning heavily on a walking stick, told of how Sam had helped him learn English during long cattle drives. Buck Williams recounted Jake's legendary ability to find water in impossible places, saving entire herds during drought years. Then Martha Jenkins rose, her hands trembling slightly as she held Jake's harmonica to her lips. The church fell completely silent as the first haunting notes of Amazing Grace filled the air. The melody, played on an instrument worn smooth by Jake's own lips, seemed to carry with it all the longing and love that had sustained Martha through 5 years of uncertainty. When the service concluded, the entire town followed the funeral procession to the cemetery on the hill overlooking Red Creek. The two graves had been dug side by side, just as Jake and Sam had lived and died, as partners. The simple wooden crosses bore their names, dates, and a shared inscription: partners in life, partners in eternity. As dirt was shoveled onto the coffins, something unexpected happened. A group of Paiute Indians appeared on the ridge above the cemetery, led by Walking Bear. The old chief raised his hand in silent salute, then placed a small bundle of sage and eagle feathers at the head of each grave, a gesture of respect from one culture to another, acknowledging the universal nature of honor and friendship. After the burial, the townspeople gathered at the community hall for a meal that had become as much celebration as wake. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and gradually the heavy weight of grief began to lighten into something resembling peace. Jake and Sam were finally home. As the sun set over the desert, Tom Bradley found himself back at the cemetery with Cookie Martinez and young Billy Hutchins. The three men stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "You think they knew?" Billy asked quietly. "In those final days, do you think they knew how many people cared about them?" Cookie crossed himself and nodded toward the fresh graves. "Mira, muchacho, look at this place today. Look at all the people who came to honor them. Men like Jake and Sam, they leave marks on the world that don't fade. They knew." Tom adjusted his hat and turned to leave, but not before placing a small bottle of whiskey between the two graves. "For the next trail, boys," he said softly. "Save some for the rest of us." As they walked back toward town, the desert wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Behind them, two simple wooden crosses stood sentinel over the final resting place of Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres, two cowboys who had ridden into legend not through great deeds or famous battles, but through the simple act of facing the impossible with courage, dignity, and unshakable loyalty to each other. In the years that followed, the story of the discovery in Devil's Canyon would become part of local folklore. Children would learn about the two cowboys who were partners to the end, and their tale would serve as a reminder that true friendship can endure any trial, even death itself. The desert had taken Jake Morrison and Samuel Torres, but it could never diminish what they had meant to the people whose lives they had touched. In Red Creek, their memory would live on as long as there were stories to tell and friends to remember them by. And on quiet desert evenings, when the wind was just right, some folks swore they could still hear the faint sound of a harmonica playing across the sage, carrying a melody of friendship that would never truly fade away.